research and strategy around climate change. But I will just underline that climate change is a big force on the economy, and it's going to be an accelerating. And we at the bank are going to have to accelerate the work we're doing, as our as our other organizations, as is the private sector. Senior Deputy Governor Wilkins, do you want to say a few words about our strategy?
Absolutely, Governor. So we do, thank you, Chair, we do have quite an extensive work program that's aimed, just as you suggest, to complement the work that's done by governments, but also by the private sector in areas that you would think about. The physical risks are the ones that are most palpable for people, because when they live them, they're affecting their daily lives. But clearly those risks, including exposures of financial institutions to physical risks, the disruptions that we've seen to economic activity, are important for us to understand. We're doing work as well on the risks of the transition. And so transition to a low carbon economy can change relative values of asset prices. It could change which sectors do better than others, and that can present risks to the financial system that we need to understand and get ready for. And that's a perfect opportunity for us. We're not a bank regulator, but for us to work with OSFI and our private sector partners on trying to understand how to get the right data and do the right analysis so that we are ready for that. And then, of course, there's this understanding how the macroeconomy is going to change. We tend to think about these risks as being, or the transition as being only one-sided, kind of downside, but in fact, there's lots of opportunities. Farmers, for example, can invest in big data, and they're doing that to improve their crop yields, and at the same time reduce their fuel consumption. These kind of changes in the macroeconomy affect how monetary policy might work, where the jobs are going to be, and again, we need to work with our counterparties to understand those as well. And finally, we've got our own job to do with our own business, making sure that we work to have the carbon footprint that we're happy with, and we're committed to doing that, and with that, building in the right amount of transparency over time.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I can get 5 seconds, if you're looking for my feedback on the $5 bill, I hope you're thinking about Terry Fox. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Okay. Mr. St. Marie, who will be followed by Mr. Julian. Gabriel, floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you. Congratulations, Governor, and welcome to the committee. And Mrs. Wilkins, hello, and thank you once again for appearing before the committee. I would like to begin for suggesting with the $5 banknote. I would suggest the chair of our committee, Mr. So let's get to business. Economists, Stiglitz and Rashid, are concerned with the following, and I'd like to have your reaction, Governor Macklem, about this. The budgetary measures and monetary measures that have been implemented during COVID-19, a lot of them don't have anything to do with are increasing reserves, rather. And so you referred to this briefly in your speech. So what economists are saying is that this brings forth the following paradox. We risk to find ourselves with a massive increase of the monetary mass, but we would have a weak use of this liquidity by households and businesses. And economists are concerned that there might be a speculative bubble on the stock market linked to this, given that there's a lot of money that's available, a lot of banknotes, unused banknotes available that are not being used by consumers and businesses, and this could create a speculative bubble. I'd like to have your comments and your analysis with regards to this concern.
Vous avez raison.
You're right. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, and we're using tools that we've never used before here in Canada. It is true that it's very difficult to anticipate all the effects linked to the use of these tools. So what the data is showing us right now is that the fiscal extension has supported household revenues and has replaced part of people's revenue due to COVID-19. So the fiscal measures have done that. And probably because households don't usually go to stores, they have seen an increase in their savings as well, because consumers are not shopping. So this is a bit of a good news story, because what we see is that households are reducing their debt. We've seen this and are now positioned with purchasing power. So I do agree that there is a risk that households will lack confidence and won't spend. And their savings rate might increase further. And this highlights the importance of reestablishing confidence among households, and even more important than confidence is to have a job, is to have revenue, to have a predictable income. When households have this confidence, and what we've seen is that when they have confidence, especially with lower interest rates, they're able to borrow and spend. And this will strongly boost the economy. So yes, there are risks, and we will do our best to manage the risks. And fiscal measures play a huge role, because this creates conditions for an economic relaunch. Yes, thank you for answering me in French. So my second question is the parallel between what your predecessor, Mr. Poloz, told us during his appearance before the committee last time, and what he said at the time is that it's very important to implement budgetary policies, fiscal policies, because of the role that the Bank of Canada and the central bank can play in such a crisis. The tools are heavily used already. Interest rates are already low. The previous governor had closed the door to the use of negative interest rates. And with fiscal policy, Mr. Poloz was highly critical of the EI regime from the beginning. This is a regime to ensure that workers who lose their job keep their revenue. And this collapsed, and it brought forth the necessary CERB and also the wage subsidy program. Do you think once the pandemic will have passed, do you think we should overhaul the current EI program, as was suggested by your predecessor? Thank you. Questions with regards to employment insurance really should be asked to the Minister of Finance. It's a very important system, and what we've found following this crisis is that it's not sufficient in a crisis, and the government therefore had to implement emergency measures. These new programs, well, the idea is that they are temporary programs during a crisis. But as for the future evolution of EI, that's up to the Government of Canada. Okay, thank you. Also,
Time.
Okay,
Thank you both. Turning to Mr. Julian, who will be followed by Mr. Morantz. Peter?
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and I second the motion for a $5 banknote with your face on it.
Yeah, I imagine.
Hopefully I'll get more time. Governor Macklem, Deputy Governor Wilkins, thank you very much for being here today. We hope your families are safe and healthy, and congratulations, Governor Macklem. It's great to have you for your first visit in your new role at Finance, and certainly we'll be hearing from you regularly. We appreciate that. Your quote earlier, the biggest risk to Canadians is not having a job, is an important one, because we are in a situation where certainly on the ground, and I can tell you, speaking to you from New Westminster, Burnaby in British Columbia, that the issue of liquidity is a big problem. I want to start off by asking what you believe the sum total of supports to the banking sector has been from the the Bank of Canada. And secondly, we asked the same question of OSFI a couple of weeks ago, and they came back with a figure of $750 billion in overall supports for the banking sector, particularly Canada's big banks, through the IMPP, through the Bank of Canada, and through OSFI itself. And yet, when we look at other countries where there have been supports putting in place for the banking sector, that has come with conditions, either through the bank or through the financial regulator. I'm thinking of the Bank of England, stopping things like dividend payments, executive bonuses, making sure that there can't be stock buybacks. So why are there no conditions attached to what is a significant amount of support going to the banking sector? And what's your evaluation of the Bank of Canada's contribution to Canada's big banks and the banking sector generally since the beginning of the pandemic?
Well, I'm going to ask Deputy Governor Wilkins to start and answer that question. She was very directly involved in the setting up of a series of new programs the Bank of Canada has brought into place. The scale of those programs goes up every week, and she can give you the latest numbers.
Deputy Governor?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, because it does highlight the fact that it is a team effort in terms of supporting the financial system. The total amount that we've done so far amounts to $341 billion, and that's outstanding. Of course, some of those activities that we've done have matured, so the peak was somewhat higher than that. But that's how much is in there. It seems like a very abstract number, though, and so if I could just take a second to talk about what is that money doing, and what's the purpose of it. And at the end of the day, it's really to help households and businesses better deal with the financial hardship that they might be feeling right now, but also to pave the way to a recovery that's sustainable. And the governor spoke about that right at the very beginning. And so our activities range from providing short-term funding to financial institutions, to corporations, provinces, municipalities, to outright purchases of assets of a longer term. So for corporate bonds, it could be corporate bonds with a remaining tenure of less than 5 years. And the reason that we do that is really to support those markets so that the private sector can also participate in a market that's more stable, that functions better. And when that happens, that means that businesses have the working capital they need. It means that if households or businesses need to use their line of credit, which they have had to do, the banks are there for them as much as they can be, and so on. And that complements some of the actions that CMHC has made in terms of their IMP program, and OSFI has made in terms of reducing the countercyclical capital buffer. With respect to the decision of the restrictions to place on banks, their dividends versus their buybacks, that's out of the Bank of Canada's purview, and I think the only thing I would add before I turn it back to the governor is to say that that's a decision of OSFI, and it needs to be taken into in the context of the fact that banks always have extra buffer in their capital than what they need as a regulatory requirement, and that can be seen as a restriction on dividends the whole time. So I'm going to turn it back to.
Sorry, yeah. So I thank you very much for that. I guess the concern in the public's mind, of course, the big banks have had over $5 billion in profits so far during this pandemic. And anecdotally, businesses are not getting access to liquidity. We're not seeing that trickle down into the community. And in fact, in many respects, the programs where businesses are accessing loans are ones where the government of Canada has basically picked up through BDC and EDC 80% of the guarantees. So what we have is the banks taking that massive amount of support, unprecedented amount of support. It's not